She arrived with a single valise, a folded paper, and a name she did not yet know how to pronounce without it sounding like a question. On her first night, an anonymous letter appeared in the mailbox. On her third week, a corrupt deputy came to take the land. And through two fevers one winter, in a garden that had been closed for 3 years, a 6-year-old boy watched everything and said nothing until the day he finally spoke. He said it was official before the wedding. It was official when she fixed the stove. This is the story of how a woman who came as a stranger became the thing a broken family did not know it had been waiting for. The paper had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft, the edges beginning to fray at the corners, like something worn down by too much handling and too much doubt. Clara Whitmore held it in both hands, not reading it anymore, because she had long since memorized every word. She held it the way a person holds onto the last solid thing in a world that has become uncertain beneath their feet. Outside the window, Wyoming rolled past in long, pale stretches of grass and sky, broken here and there by the dark shapes of cedar and juniper clinging to the sides of low hills. The land was enormous. That was the first thing a person from Ohio noticed. Not the beauty of it, not the strangeness of it, but the sheer uncompromising size of it. The sky here did not end at the horizon. It simply kept going, as if the world had been stretched open at the seams, and everything that had once been contained had spilled out into this white indifferent space. Clara did not find it beautiful. Not yet. She pressed her back straighter against the wooden seat of the train car and looked down at the letter again. Not because she needed to read it, but because looking at it was better than looking at the other passengers who had been watching her with the particular kind of curiosity that people reserve for someone traveling alone. A young woman with a small trunk, no companion, and no one waiting to receive her except a name on a paper. Ethan Hargrove, Sweetwater County, Wyoming Territory. Widower, 2 children, rancher. Those 5 facts were the sum total of what she knew about the man she was traveling toward. 5 facts and a photograph, small and slightly blurred, of a tall figure standing beside a fence post with his hat pulled low and his arms at his sides. The photograph told her almost nothing. Tall, dark hat. The fence post was well made. She had told herself that was enough. She had told herself it many times over the past 3 weeks, on the nights when she lay awake in the boarding house in Columbus, listening to the city sounds and wondering if she was making the worst mistake of her remaining life. She had told herself that any honest man with land and a working ranch was better than the textile mill, the spinning machines, the foreman who docked your wages if you were 2 minutes late and watched you with eyes that made your skin go cold in summer. She had told herself that Ohio had used up everything she had given it, and that going west was not running away, but moving toward. She almost believed it. The whistle sounded. The train began to slow. Clara folded the paper one more time and tucked it into the pocket of her coat, the gray wool coat that was the best thing she owned, clean and pressed, because she had spent 2 hours the night before making sure it was. She straightened her hat. She smoothed the front of her dress with both palms. She sat very still for a moment, her eyes fixed on the window, watching the platform of Coal Creek Station come into view through the steam in the afternoon light. Then she picked up her small valise, stood, and walked to the door of the car. She stepped down onto the platform with her chin level and her eyes open. Coal Creek was not what she had imagined, though she realized, standing there in the sharp October air with her trunk being handed down behind her, that she had not imagined it clearly at all. She had pictured something, some vague arrangement of buildings and movement, but the actual town was simultaneously smaller and more purposeful than her imagination had managed. The main street ran straight and unpretentious through the center of it, lined with wooden storefronts, a livery, a church with a white steeple that looked newer than everything around it, a general store with barrels stacked beside the door. Horses were hitched in front of the saloon. 2 men stood in conversation outside the telegraph office, not talking, just standing close together, in the way men do when they are sharing something they do not want overheard. People noticed her immediately. She had known they would. A town this size, a new face arriving by train, a young woman alone with a single trunk. She felt their attention the way you feel a change in weather, not any one specific look, but a general shift in the atmosphere, a slight turning of heads, a pause in ongoing conversations. She kept her own eyes moving, scanning the platform the way the letter had instructed. He said he would be holding a sign with her name on it, or a card, something she could recognize him by. She found him before she found the sign. He was standing at the far end of the platform, away from the cluster of people waiting for luggage and greetings. He was taller than the photograph had suggested, or maybe it was simply that photographs flattened things and made the world look smaller than it was the way this land refused to do. He wore a dusty brown hat pulled low or soaring over a weathered face, and his coat was heavy canvas, the kind that had seen several winters and carried the evidence of them in its fading and its repairs. He was holding a small piece of cardboard with her name written on it in careful, deliberate letters. Not elegant letters, but careful ones, the letters of a man who wrote slowly and meant what he wrote. He was not watching the train. He was watching the platform methodically, the way a man scans a field for something that might be out of place. His eyes, when they reached her, were gray and direct. He did not smile. He did not raise a hand. He simply held her gaze for a moment, a measuring kind of look. Not unkind, but entirely unsentimental, and then he lowered the card to his side and began walking toward her. Miss Whitmore. 2 words. No greeting behind them, no warmth in the delivery, but not coldness either. The voice of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that words cost something and that spending them carelessly was a kind of waste he could not afford. Mr. Hargrove, she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, taking inventory in the way a man does when he is trying to decide something important. Not a rude look, a considering one. Then he looked at the trunk behind her and the valise in her hand. This all of it, yes. He nodded once, picked up the trunk as if it weighed nothing at all, and began walking toward the wagon at the edge of the platform without looking back to see if she was following. She followed. There were women watching from in front of the general store. Clara noticed them the way she noticed the cold as a fact about her current situation, rather than as something she needed to respond to immediately. 3 women, perhaps 4, gathered in the particular formation that meant conversation was happening, and that the conversation was about something visible from where they were standing. One of them was older than the others, a substantial woman in a dark dress with a hat that sat very upright on her head, the kind of hat that announced its wearer's opinion of herself. She had a face that was handsome in the way of someone who had always been told so, with an expression of settled disapproval that looked too comfortable to be recent. Their eyes met Clara's and this woman's across the width of the street. The woman said something to the person beside her, her mouth moving with the precise, controlled movement of someone accustomed to being listened to. The woman beside her turned to look at Clara. Clara looked away. She climbed up onto the wagon bench and arranged her valise at her feet. Ethan Hargrove loaded the trunk into the back of the wagon without apparent effort, checked the horses out. Of habit, ran a quick hand along the nearer one's flank and climbed up beside her. He collected the reins, clicked his tongue, and the horses moved. Cold Creek began to fall away behind them. Neither of them spoke. The silence between 2 strangers on a wagon is a particular kind of silence, different from the silence between people who know each other well and have nothing to say, or the silence of an empty room. It has texture to it, weight. Clara had grown up in small rooms and close quarters, had lived in boarding houses where silence was rare and privacy was a thing you constructed out of politeness and looking away. She was not uncomfortable with quiet, but this quiet had the quality of a question that no one was certain how to begin asking. She watched the town disappear and the land open up. The road was rough but well-traveled, cutting north through the grassland with the kind of directness that suggested someone had simply chosen the most logical path and stuck to it. The sky overhead was an October sky, pale at the horizon and deep blue above, with clouds moving from the west at a pace that meant something. Clara had grown up knowing how to read weather, had learned it from her father before the sickness took him, had learned it the hard way in the years after, when knowing what the morning would bring was not a casual interest but a practical necessity. "There's weather coming," she said. Ethan glanced at the sky without turning his head, a quick reflexive assessment. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "not tonight." She nodded. He was right. She had thought the same. Another stretch of silence. "I have 2 children," he said finally, and the abruptness of it after so long without words made the information land with a particular heaviness. "Twins, a boy and a girl. They're 6 years old." "I know," she said. "Your letter mentioned them. Their mother died 3 years ago. Fever." He said it the way you say something you have had to say many times, stripped of the emotion by repetition, leaving only the facts in the delivery. "I've had people come to help with the house and the children since then. None of them stayed." Clara looked at her hands in her lap. "How many?" "3. She considered this. 3 people over 3 years, none of them staying. The letter had not told her this. The advertisement in the paper had described a widowed rancher seeking a capable woman with domestic skills. It had mentioned 2 children. It had not mentioned that 3 people before her had attempted this and left. Why did they leave, she asked. For a moment she thought he was not going to answer. The wagon rolled over a stretch of rougher ground, the wheels finding every stone in the road, and Ethan Hargrove held the reins steady without any visible effort. The children, he said. He said nothing else. Clara looked out at the grassland. A pair of hawks were riding the thermals above a low ridge to the east, circling without any apparent urgency, conserving energy against the cold. I should tell you honestly, she said, that I have no experience with children. I have not been around them very much. I know, he said. Your letter was honest about that. She had appreciated when she wrote the letter that the advertisement had not asked for experience with children. It had asked for capability and willingness to work. She had told herself this was because Mr. Hargrove was a practical man who understood that capability could be applied to unfamiliar situations. She had not considered the alternative that perhaps he had stopped expecting experience and was simply hoping for someone who would not run. I won't promise I'll be good at it, she said. I'll promise I'll try. That's all I'm asking. The road curved north and the land changed character, growing hillier, the grass giving way to patches of cedar and juniper, the horizon pulling back and reforming in new shapes. The light was beginning its afternoon decline, going golden and long, casting shadows that stretched eastward across the ground. Is there anything you want to ask me? She said. Ethan considered the question with the same deliberateness he seemed to apply to most things. Not right now, he said. There'll be time. She accepted this. It seemed fair. There was time. That was one thing this territory apparently had in abundance. The ranch appeared as the shadows were beginning to pool in the low places between the hills, the way darkness always arrived in the west, not all at once, but piece by piece, settling into the hollows first and working upward. Clara saw the buildings before she could make out their details, a cluster of structures against the hillside larger than she had expected, more substantial. The house was 2 stories built from hewn timber that had weathered to a silver gray, with a wide porch running the full length of the front. Several outbuildings surrounded it, a barn that was newer than the house, a smaller structure that might have been a smokehouse, a long, low building further back where the ranch hands presumably slept, a corral to one side with half a dozen horses moving in the fading light. Chickens scattered as the wagon came through the gate. A dog appeared from somewhere, a large, good-natured animal with a rough gray coat, barking with enthusiasm rather than menace. Ethan said one word and it went quiet, falling into step beside the wagon as if it had simply been waiting for the instruction. Everything was well maintained. That was the first thing she noticed, and then looking more closely, she noticed the second thing. Everything was also tired. Not neglected, not falling apart, but carrying the particular weight of a place that had more work than hands to do it, where maintenance was a constant effort rather than an occasional one, where things were kept up out of necessity and determination rather than ease. Ethan pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and climbed down. He did not offer her a hand. She had not expected him to. She climbed down herself, her legs stiff from the ride, and stood for a moment on the ground looking up at the house. Up close it was even larger, the porch wrapped around 2 sides. Someone had planted something along the foundation, the remains of it still visible in the dead stalks of what had been some kind of border planting, though nothing living remained of it now. Ethan went to the porch and called simply, "Rosie, Cole." The door opened almost before the words had finished. 2 figures came through it at speed, the way children move when they have been waiting and have finally been given permission to stop. They stopped at the edge of the porch and looked down at Clara. They were identical in height and general build, both of them lean and quick-looking, with the sun-bleached hair of children who spent most of their time outdoors. The girl wore a dress that had been carefully mended in several places, but was clean, her hair in 2 braids that were already escaping their arrangement. The boy wore trousers and a dark shirt, his hands shoved into his pockets, his face perfectly still. They both had their father's eyes, that same steady gray, that same careful measuring quality. But in them it was paired with something else, something younger and rawer. Not unfriendliness exactly, more like the watchfulness of creatures that had been surprised too many times and had decided that expectation was a luxury they could no longer afford. "This is Miss Whitmore," Ethan said. "She'll be staying with us. You'll treat her with respect." The girl looked at Clara with frank assessment. "Are you going to cry?" she asked. The question was delivered without malice, as straightforwardly as a question about the weather, as if it were simply a piece of practical information she needed. Clara looked at her. "I might," she said. "I cry sometimes when things are hard or sad, but I won't cry because of you. That I can promise." The girl considered this with apparent seriousness. Her brother said nothing, but something shifted in his expression, something very small. The way a door opens just slightly, not enough to see through, but enough to let air move. "Do you know any stories?" the girl asked. "Rosie," Ethan said. "It's all right," Clara said. She looked at the girl. "I know some. Good ones, I think. Not the kind where everything happens by accident and no one earns anything." "The last lady didn't know any stories," the girl said. "She read from a book, but she didn't know how to do the voices." "I'll do the voices," Clara said. The girl looked at her brother. Something passed between them. The silent communication of people who have grown up sharing everything, a conversation conducted entirely in the language of small signals. "Can you braid hair?" Rosie asked. "Yes." "Can you make biscuits that aren't hard?" "I can." The boy spoke for the first time. "Can you fix a fence rail?" His voice was his father's voice, in miniature, flat and direct, stripping away anything unnecessary. Clara looked at him steadily. "Not yet, but I can learn if someone shows me how." Cole looked at his father. Ethan said nothing, but Clara saw his jaw move slightly, the almost imperceptible adjustment of a man absorbing information he had not expected. "Pa says if you're willing to learn, you can do just about anything," Cole said. It was not quite an endorsement, but it was not nothing either. Ethan cleared his throat. "Inside, both of you. Wash up before supper." The twins turned and went back through the door without argument, their feet loud on the wooden floor. Ethan watched them go. In the moment before he turned away, with his back to Clara and his face in profile, she saw something in his expression that belonged to the long territory between loss and love. In that territory that people occupy when they love something fiercely and imperfectly and are not certain they are doing it well. He turned. "Your room is upstairs, second door on the left." He picked up her trunk from the wagon as if it were an afterthought. "Get settled. Come down when you're ready. There's stew from this afternoon that needs warming." He carried the trunk inside before she had finished nodding. Clara stood for a moment longer in the yard, looking at the house, at the mountains beginning to materialize in the twilight to the west, at the horses moving in the corral, at the last of the day's light catching the weather vane on top of the barn. She breathed in. The air smelled like dry grass and pine, and something she could not name, something particular to this place and this time of year, clean and cold, and very far from Ohio. She went inside. The house was dim and purposeful. No decorations that she could see, no pictures on the walls of the entryway, no small ornamental objects on the side table by the door. What there was evidence of use of a household that functioned and worked and had no time for things that did not serve a function. A row of coat hooks, all of them loaded. A pair of muddy boots by the door, too large to be children's. A rifle hanging on the wall to the right of the door in a way that suggested it was there to be reached quickly rather than displayed. The smell of the house was wood smoke and old coffee and something else, a particular kind of emptiness, that Clara had no better word for the emptiness that accumulates in spaces where people are present, but something essential is absent. She went upstairs. The second door on the left opened into a small room with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a single window that looked out over the hills to the north. Someone had left a pitcher of water and a folded towel on top of the dresser. The pitcher was clean, the towel was clean, the gesture was small and practical, and it told her something about the man downstairs that nothing else so far had quite managed to convey. She sat on the edge of the bed. For 1 minute she sat very still and let herself feel the full weight of where she was and how she had arrived here and how far this was from anything she had known before. She let herself feel it completely because she had learned the hard way that feelings you refuse to acknowledge had a way of surfacing at the worst possible moment, and she could not afford a worst possible moment. Not now, not in this place with two watchful children downstairs and a man who had not offered her his hand when she stepped down from the wagon. She felt it all. The fear underneath the steadiness, The loneliness that had become so familiar, it felt almost like a companion. The particular vulnerability of arriving somewhere new, with nothing to offer except your willingness to work and your refusal to break. Then she put it down. Set it aside the way you set aside a heavy thing when you need your hands free. She washed her face with the water in the pitchers, changed the collar on her dress, pinned her hair back neatly, and went downstairs. The kitchen was large and practical, a stone fireplace at one end, a long work table in the center shelves along two walls holding an assortment of pots and jars and implements that spoke of serious use. The stove was a good one solid iron, the kind that held heat well if you knew how to manage it. Clara looked at it for a moment, taking in its particulars, the way it sat slightly lower on the left side, the way the damper handle was positioned, the small things about any stove that you could learn by looking if you knew what you were looking for. She found the stew in the pot at the back, thick and good-smelling beef and root vegetables, the work of someone who knew what they were doing with simple ingredients. She stirred it and adjusted the damper and began setting the table without being asked, finding the dishes where she expected to find them and the cutlery in the drawer to the right of the basin, because that was where cutlery lived in any well-organized kitchen. Ethan came in from somewhere outside, bringing cold air with him. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the table already set and at Clara moving between the stove and the shelf at home in someone else's kitchen, in the way of a person who has worked in many kitchens and carries the knowledge in her hands. He said nothing. He went to wash up at the basin. The twins came down together, a controlled tumble, both of them clean-faced and marginally tidier than they had been on the porch. Rosie had rebraided her own hair with limited success. Cole had tucked his shirt in. They sat in their usual places with the ease of habit. Supper was quiet, not unfriendly, simply quiet in the way of a family that had grown accustomed to silence at the table and had not found sufficient reason to replace it. The stew was good. The bread was from that morning a little past its best, but still substantial. Clara ate and listened and watched without appearing to watch. Coley ate efficiently, steadily like his father. Rosie ate in fits and starts, distracted by her own thoughts, stopping to look out the window, resuming stopping again. Ethan cut his bread into pieces before eating it and left the heel untouched. Near the end of the meal, Rosie said without any particular preamble, "Where did you come from before Ohio?" "Rosie," Ethan said. "It's all right," Clara said again. And this time she thought she saw something in Ethan's face at the repetition of those words, some small recognition, though she could not have said what it was a recognition of. "My family came from Pennsylvania originally. My parents moved to Columbus before I was born. I grew up in the city." "Is it very big?" Rosie asked. "Bigger than Cold Creek, but places can be large and still feel small, depending on the life you live in them." Cole looked up from his bowl. "How did you end up here?" The question was direct and genuine and without the social awareness that would have made an adult hesitate to ask it. Clara looked at the boy across the table. "I wrote a letter," she said simply, "and your father wrote back." Cole looked at his father. Ethan looked at his bowl. After supper, Ethan told the children to help clear the table, and they did without significant complaint, which Clara suspected was because they were on their best behavior, testing the waters, reserving judgment. She helped wash the dishes while Ethan went to check on something outside, and Rosie stood beside her with a drying cloth, working with the haphazard thoroughness of a child who has been told this is their job and accepts it without enthusiasm. "The lady before you," Rosie said conversationally. "She cried on the second night. We could hear her through the wall." "That must have been hard to hear," Clara said. Rosie considered this. "We didn't make her cry," she said. It was important to her, apparently, that this was understood. "I know you didn't," Clara said. "How do you know?" "Because you're telling me about it. People who feel guilty about things generally don't bring them up." Rosie looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but something in between. Cold drying the pot he had been handed did not look up, but his hands stilled for just a moment. Later, when the children had gone upstairs and the house was quiet, Clara went to the kitchen to make sure the stove was banked properly for the night. She was standing at it when she heard the front door and then Ethan's boots on the floor of the front room. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. He was holding something in one hand, a small square of paper folded once. He looked at it for a moment with an expression she could not fully read, not angry and not troubled. Exactly more the face of a man who has found a stone in a road he walks every day, and is deciding whether it is significant. This was in the mailbox, he said. It was there when I went to check on the horses. I don't know when it arrived. He looked at her, then at the paper, then at her again. I thought you should know it exists. He set it on the table between them. He did not open it. He stood there for a moment as if waiting for something, though she could not have said what, and then he turned and went down the hall to his own room. Clara looked at the folded paper on the table. She did not touch it. She stood there for a long moment listening to the house settle into its nighttime sounds, the creak of the stairs under Ethan's weight, the distant sound of a horse moving in the corral, the wind beginning to come up outside. Then she turned off the lamp and went upstairs. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room with the window looking north and stared at the ceiling in the dark and told herself what she always told herself, that tomorrow was a new set of hours and that she had gotten through every set of hours that had come before this one. And that was a fact the darkness could not argue with. She slept. The morning came cold and gray as Ethan had predicted, the weather arriving from the west sometime before dawn and settling in over the ranch with the purposeful weight of a season making itself felt. Clara was dressed and in the kitchen before the sun was fully up, feeding the stove, getting the heat established, taking stock of what was in the pantry with the methodical attention of someone who understood that knowing your resources was the first requirement of managing them. The pantry was reasonably stocked. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, smoked meat, a good supply of preserves, root vegetables in the cellar below. Whoever had been managing the household before her had been competent, at least in terms of provisioning. She found the coffee, measured it, got the pot on. She had the biscuits in the oven and the bacon beginning when she discovered the problem. The stove was drafting wrong. The left side ran hot and the right side barely held temperature, which meant that anything that required even heat would need constant moving, which meant the biscuits she had just put in were going to be unevenly cooked unless she managed them carefully, and the timing she had established was no longer reliable. She looked at the stove. She opened the back panel, a thing she had done on a dozen stoves in a dozen kitchens over the years, and found what she expected to find. The damper on the left flue was stuck partly open, letting too much draw. She needed something to hold it in position. She looked around the kitchen, found a length of wire in the drawer where useful things accumulated, the kind of drawer that every working household has, and bent it into the shape she needed with her hands, using the edge of the counter for leverage. It took 8 minutes. The stove evened out. She moved the biscuits to compensate for the time lost and adjusted the bacon. She had not heard anyone come downstairs, but when she turned around, an old man was standing in the doorway of the kitchen watching her with an expression of complete neutrality. He was very old or very weathered or possibly both, with a face like a piece of country that had been shaped by a long time of wind and sun, and eyes that were a pale, clear gray that saw considerably more than they appeared to. You fixed the flue, he said. It was not quite a question. The left damper was stuck, she said. Do you want coffee? Yes, he said, and sat down at the table with the ease of someone who had been sitting at this table for a very long time. I'm Clara Whitmore, she said. Pete, he said. I've been with this ranch since before Mr. Hargrove's father built the barn. He accepted the cup she set in front of him and looked at it. The last 3 didn't fix the stove, he said. They complained about it. Clara set the rest of the cups out on the table. Complaining about a thing doesn't change the thing, she said. Pete looked at her over the rim of his cup. He said nothing, but something in the lines of his face settled slightly, like a question being set aside because the answer has been found. Rosie came downstairs first with Cole close behind. They stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara and then at Pete and then at each other. Biscuits, Rosie said with the certainty of someone who has identified something important. In 10 minutes, Clara said. Wash your hands. They went without argument. Pete watched them go and then looked at Clara again. He said, which seemed to be his version of significant commentary. Ethan came down last, already dressed for the day's work, which began at dawn, and apparently did not wait for weather. He looked at the table, at the coffee and the 4 cups, and Pete sitting in his usual place, and then at Clara standing at the stove with a complete lack of self-consciousness about occupying someone else's kitchen. Morning, she said. Morning, he said, and poured his own coffee. The first 3 weeks were the education she had not known she needed. The twins tested her with the systematic creativity of children who had developed testing into an art form through necessity and practice. The salt in the sugar bowl was discovered before any serious damage was done, because Clara had tasted the sugar before she used it, a habit from a childhood of kitchens where you never assumed anything. The frog in her shoe was she genuinely felt an interesting choice, and she handled it as described, which appeared to short-circuit something in Cole's strategic planning. Rosie's hair became a morning ritual. Clara worked out the tangles with a patience that came from understanding that the tangles were not the point, that the point was the 15 minutes every morning when Rosie sat still and listened to a story, and that this was not indulgence but necessity. She learned that Rosie's attention could be held by any story in which the main character had to solve something that seemed impossible, and that Cole, who invariably appeared to be doing something else on the other side of the room during these sessions, was actually listening to every word. She learned that Cole got quiet when something troubled him, and that this quiet was different from his ordinary quiet, and that the difference was subtle enough to be missed if you were not paying attention. She learned that Rosie's loudness was frequently a flag, that the more noise she generated, the more carefully Clara needed to look at what was actually happening beneath the surface of the noise. She learned that Ethan drank his coffee black and that he was done with the barn before she came down most mornings, and that he worked with a focused, tireless efficiency that made the ranch hands move faster simply by proximity, not through any express demand, but through the simple mechanism of being an example that was difficult to ignore. She learned that old Pete watched everything and said very little, and that what he said when he said it was worth hearing. She learned the rhythms of the ranch in the way you learn the rhythms of any complex living thing, by being present for them, by letting them move through you until you can feel the wrongness of a day that is not following its pattern. And slowly, as October deepened and the first real cold came down from the mountains, she felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. Something she did not have an immediate name for. Something that lived in the space between arriving and belonging, not quite one and not yet the other. She was 7 days into her time at the ranch when she found the garden. She had been walking the fence line on the north side of the house, looking at the condition of the posts and the wire, making a mental note of where repair was needed, when she noticed the gap in the fence that was not a gap, but a gate set into the south wall of the house yard, half hidden by the growth of the hawthorn hedge that had been allowed to spread unchecked. She stopped and looked at it. Beyond the gate was a space that had once been intentional. She could see this even in its current state of abandonment, the lines of it still visible beneath the overgrowth, the arrangement that spoke of someone's thought and care. There were raised beds, their wooden borders still intact, filled now with a dense tangle of dead growth. The remains of a path wound between them, flagstones still in place but heaved by several seasons of frost and hidden under debris. At the far end, a bench sat against the fence, weathered to gray, one of its boards cracked, but the structure still sound. Clara stood at the gate for a long moment. She did not go in. She went back to the house and found old Pete mending a harness strap in the small room off the kitchen that served as a general workroom. "The garden on the north side," she said, "the one behind the gate." Pete looked up from the harness. His expression did not change, but something in it became more deliberate, more careful. "Margaret's garden," he said. "She put that in the second year she was here. Worked on it every spring and fall." He looked down at the harness again. "Mr. Hargrove told everyone to leave it after she passed." Clara nodded. "How long ago did anyone go in there?" 3 years, Pete said. "Give or take." She did not go into the garden. She walked back out to the fence line and finished her assessment of the wire. But that evening after supper, when the children were doing their lessons at the kitchen table, and Ethan was going over ledgers in his office, Clara stood at the kitchen window and looked out toward the north side of the house, toward the place she could not quite see from this angle but knew was there. She thought about what it meant to leave a space untouched, whether it was a way of keeping something or a way of refusing to let it go. She thought these were possibly the same thing and possibly very different things, and that which one it was probably mattered. Ethan came into the kitchen for a cup of water. She heard him stop behind her. "You're looking at the garden," he said. She turned. He was not asking a question. He was stating a fact the same way he stated most facts, with the directness of someone who had decided that accuracy was more useful than diplomacy. "I could see it from the fence line today," she said. "It was Margaret's." He picked up the water cup. She was out there every morning that the weather allowed, even in winter, sometimes just to look at it. Clara looked at him steadily. She did not speak. She had learned already that Ethan Hargrove's silences were often his way of arriving at something that if you waited without filling the space, he would frequently find his way to what he actually meant to say. She said soil was the only honest thing she knew, he said. Said you put work into it and it gave you something back. Didn't lie to you about what it was. She sounds like she was a remarkable person, Clara said. She was. He set the cup down. She would have had an opinion about you, he said. A specific one. She always did. Clara could not read whether this was meant as something positive or something neutral. She did not ask. I didn't go into the garden, she said. I thought you should know I saw it, but I didn't go in. He looked at her with that measuring quality she had come to recognize, the look that was not judgment exactly, but an assessment, taking in information and weighing it. I know, he said. Pete told me. She nodded. Of course he had. Ethan stood there for a moment longer, as if there was something else he meant to say, and was deciding whether to say it. Then he said simply, "Good night, Miss Whitmore," and went back down the hall. Clara turned back to the window. Outside, the night was fully dark, the stars obscured by cloud. The wind had picked up again. She thought about the folded paper still sitting on the kitchen table where Ethan had left it the night before. She had not touched it. She had moved around it during the day the way you move around something you have decided not to look at yet, not because you are afraid of it, but because the time has not been right. But it was there. It was a thing that existed in the world now, and she understood enough about the way things worked to know that things that existed did not stop existing simply because you declined to acknowledge them. She went to the table and stood there looking at it. Then she picked it up and she opened it. The handwriting inside was careful but not particularly educated, the letters formed by someone who wrote with intention rather than practice. There were only 2 lines. Ask her why she really left Columbus. There are things she hasn't told you. A woman like that doesn't leave a city for no reason. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it again along its existing creases and set it back on the table exactly where it had been. She stood very still for a long moment. Then she went to the stove, checked the damper, banked the fire correctly for the night, and went upstairs to bed. Lying in the dark, she thought about what the note said and what it was designed to do, and she found that she was not frightened and not particularly angry. What she felt was a cold, clear recognition of the shape of the problem. Someone in Cold Creek had seen her arrive and had decided within 24 hours that her presence here was something to be prevented. The note was a probe. It was designed to plant doubt, to make Ethan Hargrove begin looking at her differently, to introduce the question of whether she was keeping something from him. The answer, of course, was that she was not. She had left Columbus because there was nothing left in Columbus to stay for. The textile mill had closed. The boarding house had raised its rates beyond what she could cover on the work available. She had no family. She had no prospects. She had, in the end, answered an advertisement in a newspaper because it was the most honest option available to her, more honest than continuing to try to carve a life out of a city that had decided it had no further use for her. There was nothing in this history that was shameful. There was nothing in it that a person of good faith would use against her. But she also knew that good faith was not the operative quality here. Someone wanted her gone, and they were willing to use Ethan Hargrove's uncertainty to accomplish it. She thought about the woman in front of the general store, the hat that sat so upright, the mouth moving with that controlled, deliberate precision. She thought, I have met women like that before. I know what they want, and I know that the best thing I can do is nothing that confirms what they are already saying. She turned onto her side and looked at the window. The sky had cleared while she lay there. She could see stars again, and an enormous spread of them, more than she had ever been able to see in the city, where the lights of human habitation washed out everything except the brightest. She looked at them for a while. Then she closed her eyes. In the morning, she went to the garden. Not inside it, she stood at the gate and looked in, really looked the way you look at something when you have decided to take it seriously. She looked at the raised beds and the dead growth and the path beneath the debris and the bench at the far end. She looked at it long enough to begin to understand its shape, to see what it had been and what it could be, the bones of something that had been built with intention and had not been destroyed by neglect, but only interrupted by it. Then she went back to the kitchen and made breakfast. Ethan came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway and looked at her. and she thought she saw something flicker across his face, quickly gone before she could identify it. "The note," he said. "Did you read it?" She set the coffee in front of him. "Yes." And she sat down across from him. This was the first time she had done this, sat at the table with him rather than standing or moving, and she felt the small significance of it, the choice to be at the same level rather than occupied elsewhere. "I left Columbus because the mill closed and I couldn't afford to stay," she said. "That is the complete answer to the question in that note. There is nothing else, Shivo." He looked at her, said nothing. "Someone wrote that note to make you wonder about me," she said. "They're going to do more than write notes. I think you should know that I know this so that when it happens, you're not surprised and neither am I." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "You know who it is. I have a strong suspicion." "Mrs. Doyle," he said. It was not a question. Clara said nothing. He nodded once slowly. "She's been the leading voice in Cold Creek on most matters for 20 years, he said. "Her husband owns the bank." He paused. "She had a different idea about what I should do after Margaret passed. A different woman she thought was more suitable." "Her niece," Clara said. He looked at her with something that was almost not quite, but almost the beginning of a smile. "Pete talks," he said. "Old Pete watches and listens and occasionally shares what he learns," Clara said. "It's a skill. I respect it." This time the not-quite smile made it slightly closer to actual expression. Rosie appeared in the kitchen doorway, already half-dressed, her braids half undone from the night. She looked at her father sitting at the table with his coffee and Clara sitting across from him, in the air between them that was different from the usual air, not hostile and not tense, but present in a new way, the air of two people who have had a real conversation. "Are you having breakfast without us?" Rosie demanded. "The biscuits aren't done yet," Clara said. "Get your brother and wash your faces." Rosie turned and went, her feet on the stairs, a comfortable thunder. Ethan looked at his coffee. "Thank you," he said, "for being straightforward." "It seemed more useful than the alternative," she said. He nodded again, and when he looked up this time for just a moment, the full weight of his attention was on her, not the measuring look, not the assessing look, but something simpler and more direct. The look of a man who is trying to understand something that matters to him. Then Cole appeared in the doorway, where Rosie had been looking at both of them with his father's gray eyes. "Are the biscuits done?" he asked. "Almost," Clara said. He came in and sat down at his usual place. And then Rosie came in behind him, and Pete came in from outside, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary, complex, irreplaceable noise of people beginning another day together. Outside, past the kitchen window in the space behind the gate on the north side of the house, the wind moved through the dead stalks of Margaret's garden. But if you look carefully at the soil near the fence where the sun fell longest and warmest in the afternoon, you could see that the ground was not entirely hard. That it was possible with patience and with work that it might be ready for something new. Clara looked out the window while she turned the biscuits. She did not say this to anyone. She did not need to. She simply made a note of it, the way you make a note of any fact that might become useful, and added it to the growing inventory of things she was learning about this place, this family, and what it might mean to belong to both. The second week announced itself with wind. It came down from the northwest in the early hours before dawn, finding every gap in the house's construction, every place where the caulking had dried and shrunk away from the wood, and moving through those places with the particular persistence of cold that has not yet reached its full strength but intends to. Clara lay in her narrow bed and listened to it and thought about what winter would mean here in this place where the sky was enormous and the nearest neighbor was 4 miles distant, and the woodpile behind the barn needed another 2 weeks of serious work to be adequate. She had calculated this on her fourth day. She had not been asked to calculate it. But she had looked at the woodpile and looked at the house and thought about what a winter in this territory required, and the numbers had not been comfortable. She mentioned it to Pete at breakfast. He looked at her over his coffee cup with those pale, clear eyes. "Told him the same thing 2 weeks ago," he said. "He knows. He's been short-handed since September." "What happened in September?" "Two of the ranch hands left for better wages in Colorado." Pete set down his cup. "He hasn't found replacements yet." Clara nodded, filed this away with the other things she was filing. The morning of the second week also brought the full expression of the stove problem, which she had partially solved with wire, but which revealed as she worked more extensively in the kitchen a secondary issue in the right side firebox that she had not initially found. She discovered it when she was attempting to get a consistent temperature for preserving an ambitious project she had started, in part because the pantry shelves had empty spaces where preserved goods should have been, and in part because it gave her something complex to focus on. She was standing with the back panel open again, her hands inside the flue housing, when she heard someone behind her. She expected Pete. She turned and found Ethan. He was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the expression of a man who has formed an expectation and found it incorrect in a way that requires him to revise something. "The right firebox has a cracked baffle," she said without preamble, because that was the relevant information. "I can pack it with stove clay, if you have any, but it should be replaced properly before hard winter. The left side I fixed with wire on the first morning, but that's a temporary solution." He looked at the stove. Pete should have caught that. "Pete has a great deal to attend to," she said. "I expect the kitchen wasn't his priority." He looked at her again. Something in his face shifted very slightly, the adjustment of a man who is recognizing that he has been given something he did not know he needed and is not entirely certain how to respond to it. "There's stove clay in the workroom," he said. "I'll pack the baffle tonight." "I can do it," she said. "I know you can," he said, "but I'll do it." He came back that evening after supper, while Clara was washing the last of the dishes, and repaired the baffle with the focused efficiency of a man who worked with his hands constantly and trusted them. He did not say much. He did not need to. Clara continued with the dishes and did not offer commentary, and this shared occupation of the same space without friction felt like its own kind of communication. When he was finished, he washed his hands at the basin and said, "The woodpile needs attention." "I know," she said. "I can help with splitting if you show me the technique." He turned and looked at her with that specific look, the not-quite smile that lives somewhere in the territory between surprise and approval. "I'll have Pete show you," he said. "He has more patience for teaching than I do." This was the most self-aware thing he had said to her in a week, and Clara received it as the offering it was. Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, ostensibly for water, factually conducting reconnaissance. He looked at his father by the stove, and Clara at the basin, and the quiet between them that was no longer the quiet of strangers. "Good night, Cole," Clara said without turning from the basin. The boy got his water and went back upstairs without saying anything. But his feet on the stairs were slower going up than they had been coming down the careful steps of someone who is thinking about something. It was Pete who told her on the morning of the 11th day that Ethan had gone alone to the woodpile at 4 in the morning and had been there until breakfast. She did not mention this to Ethan, but she made sure his coffee was hot and his biscuits were ready, and that when he came in from the cold, with his hands raw and his shoulders carrying the particular fatigue of several hours of hard physical work, there was a meal waiting that was worth sitting down to. He ate without comment, but he ate all of it. The Sunday in the third week was the first Sunday Clara went into Cold Creek. Ethan had not suggested it, but he had not suggested against it, and Clara understood that the question of whether she appeared in public and how and when was a question with consequences either way. Staying away created one set of impressions. Appearing created another. She preferred to manage impressions by being present because you could not control what people said about you when you were absent, but you could control, to some degree, what they observed when you were there. She wore the gray coat. She pinned her hair carefully. She sat beside Ethan in the wagon with Rosie between them and Cole on the other side, and she looked at the road ahead and did not fidget. The church in Cold Creek was the white-steepled building she had noticed when she arrived, newer than everything around it, with a congregation that filled it to perhaps two-thirds capacity on this particular Sunday, and that turned its collective attention to the Hargrove family and their addition with the focused interest of people for whom new information is a significant event. The service was unremarkable. The minister was competent and earnest and preached on the subject of patience with a directness that Clara found almost pointed. She sat straight and listened and held Rosie's hand when the girl began swinging her feet against the pew and did not meet anyone's eyes except when it would have been conspicuous not to. After the service in the yard outside was where it became interesting. The woman Clara had identified as Mrs. Agnes Doyle appeared at her elbow with the smoothness of someone who has been planning their approach since the previous Wednesday. She was up close exactly as formidable as she had appeared across the width of a street, with a face arranged into an expression of welcoming warmth that did not reach the eyes. "You must be Miss Whitmore," she said, extending a gloved hand. "We have all been so looking forward to meeting you." Clara shook the hand. "Mrs. Doyle," she said. "I've heard your name." Something very small happened behind Mrs. Doyle's eyes. A brief adjustment. She had expected less directness. "All good things, I hope," she said with a smile that suggested the concept of good things was negotiable. "Informative things," Clara said pleasantly. The women gathered around Mrs. Doyle shifted slightly, the way a group shifts when the social weather changes. Several of them were looking at Clara with the frank curiosity of people who had formed opinions based on incomplete information and were now collecting data to refine those opinions. Mrs. Doyle pivoted with the grace of long practice. "We were just saying how remarkable it is that you've settled in so quickly, coming all the way from Ohio, and into such a complex household." She let the word complex do its work and waited. Clara looked at her calmly. "Every household has its complexities," she said. "I find it keeps things interesting." "I'm sure." Mrs. Doyle's eyes moved to the children where Rosie had found a friend, and Cole was standing apart watching a horse tied to the fence. "The children seem to have taken to you. That's a blessing." A pause timed with precision. "You have experience with children." Then I understood from some of what circulated that you came without much in the way of family background of your own. This was the moment. Clara could feel the room such as it was paying attention without appearing to. This was the probe, the designed question, the one that was supposed to make her uncertain or defensive or evasive. "I grew up in Columbus, Ohio," Clara said, with the same calm she would bring to describing the weather. "My parents died when I was young. I worked in a textile mill from the age of 13. When the mill closed, I answered Mr. Hargrove's advertisement because it offered honest work in a stable situation." She looked at Mrs. Doyle without any particular heat. "I don't have family background. I have work history and the ability to manage a household. I find those more useful." The silence around them was brief but complete. Mrs. Doyle smiled. It was a remarkable smile, Clara thought, the kind of smile that has been practiced until it functions regardless of what the face is actually trying to express. "Of course," she said, "practical accomplishments are so valuable in a frontier setting." "Miss Clara," said a small voice, and Clara looked down to find Rosie at her side, her hand slipping into Clara's with the unself-conscious confidence of a child who has made a decision. "Can we go find Cole? He's been watching that horse for too long, and it makes me nervous." Clara looked down at the girl, then she looked up at Mrs. Doyle. "If you'll excuse me," she said, "it was a pleasure to meet you properly." She let Rosie lead her away across the churchyard, and she did not look back because looking back would have told Mrs. Doyle something she did not need to know. On the wagon ride home, Rosie told Cole that Clara had talked back to Mrs. Doyle and that it had been remarkable. Cole looked at Clara with a measuring expression that was his father's expression in miniature. "Did you win?" he asked. "Nobody won," Clara said. "It was a conversation. Did she leave first or did you leave first?" A pause. "We left first." Cole nodded, apparently satisfied. Rosie leaned against Clara's arm with the comfortable weight of a child who has decided something. Ethan, driving, said nothing, but his jaw had a different quality than it had on the way to town. That evening, he found her at the kitchen table going over a household ledger she had asked his permission to review. He sat down across from her, the same position as that morning, with the coffee, a positioning she was beginning to understand at his version of choosing to have a real conversation. "Mrs. Doyle said something to you," he said. "Several things. And you said several things back." "I was straightforward," Clara said. "I don't see the value in being otherwise." He turned his coffee cup. "She's been suggesting to people that your status here is irregular, that the arrangement isn't properly formalized." Clara looked at him. "Is she wrong?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "She's not wrong. I should have thought of it sooner. I will think of it now." "What does that mean practically?" "It means," he said carefully in the way of a man choosing words, "because they are the right words, and not because they come easily, that I would like to discuss the matter more formally. When the time seems right." Clara held his gaze. In the silence of the kitchen, with the stove repaired and the preserves lined up on the shelf and the sound of the wind outside that they had both assessed correctly and separately, before either of them knew the other existed, she understood that this was the closest Ethan Hargrove came to a declaration. "All right," she said, "when the time seems right." He nodded. And they returned to the ledger. The anonymous letter was something she carried now as a fact, like the cracked baffle in the woodpile and the distance to the nearest neighbor. She had told Ethan what it said and what she understood it to mean, and he had listened, and she had seen in his listening the effort it cost him to trust someone in the specific way the situation required. She gave him credit for it. Trust that cost nothing to extend was not the same as trust that required something. The garden she had not touched. She walked past it every day going to or from the fence line, and sometimes she stopped at the gate and looked in, but she had not opened the gate. It was not her space. She understood this without being told. Some things you earn the right to approach gradually, and you know when you have earned it, not because anyone tells you, but because the knowledge arrives on its own. She was thinking about this, standing at the gate in the thin afternoon light of the third week's end, when Pete appeared at her shoulder. He stood beside her without speaking for a moment, looking at the garden, the way he looked at most things directly and without sentimentality. "She planted the first bed herself," he said finally. "Margaret hauled the soil from the creek bed by hand because she said the soil here was too alkaline and needed amending." He paused. "Ethan built the beds for her, spent a whole weekend on it, never did understand why she needed wooden frames for dirt, but he built them anyway because she asked." Clara looked at the beds. She could see them now that she knew to look for the specific shape of them, the wooden borders emerging from the tangle. "He never talks about her," she said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. "He talks about her to Cole sometimes," Pete said, "when he thinks nobody hears. Cole has her habit of sitting quiet and listening. Ethan knows it." He paused again. "The boy doesn't say much, but he keeps things. Remember them?" Clara thought about Cole's gray eyes watching her across the kitchen table. Keeping things. "The fence on the east pasture," Pete said, transitioning without ceremony in the way of someone who has said what they came to say and is moving on. "Third post from the oak tree is rotting at the base. I meant to mention it." "I'll note it," Clara said. He went back toward the barn. Clara stood at the gate for another moment, then turned and followed. That night, Ethan stayed late at the kitchen table going over the ledger she had reorganized, and she was putting away the supper dishes when he said without looking up, "You are categorized the household expenses." "They were mixed in with the ranch accounts," she said. "It makes the actual costs harder to track." A pause. "Where did you learn to keep accounts?" "The mill kept records," she said. "I helped the floor manager with inventory for 2 years. He showed me what he knew." She set the last bowl on the shelf. "I'm not a bookkeeper, but I can see when numbers are organized in a way that obscures information rather than clarifies it." He looked up from the ledger. "It was Margaret who used to do this," he said. "After she died, I did my best with it. But numbers were not her best skill, and they are not mine." "You've managed," Clara said. "Barely," he said. And the frankness of it, the simple, direct admission from a man who was not given to admissions of any kind, landed in the room with surprising weight. "I can keep the household accounts," she said, "if that would be useful." He looked at the ledger and then at her. "It would," he said. She hung the dishcloth and went to sit across from him. They worked through the rest of the ledger together, clarifying the patterns, and Ethan confirming or correcting the context she was missing. And by the time the fire had burned low, they had a clearer picture of the ranch's financial situation than it had apparently had in 3 years. It was not desperate, but it was tighter than it should have been, and there were places where costs could be reduced and others where income was not being maximized. And Clara could see both of these things with the clarity of someone who has no emotional investment in how things have always been done. "The east pasture hay yield," she said, pointing to a figure. "It's lower than the previous 3 years. Is that a soil issue or a moisture issue?" He looked at the figure. Something crossed his face that was not quite surprise and not quite something else, a recalibration. "Soil," he said. "I've been meaning to rest it. Haven't had the time to rearrange the grazing rotation. If you rest the ass pasture over winter and move the herd to the northern section, the yield should recover by spring." She looked at the map she had sketched from the ledger's descriptions. "The northern section has better access to the creek anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Then, you figured that out from the ledger. And from walking the fence lines, she said, the grass in the northern section is still deeper than the east, even this late in the season. The cattle have been preferring it when they have the choice. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, the way he had looked at her once before, and in that look she could see the effort of a man who had been managing everything alone for too long, and who was for the first time in a long time sitting across from someone who was genuinely useful. You've been walking the fence lines, he said. Every day, she said. I need to know the land if I'm going to understand the household. He was quiet again. Outside, the wind had dropped and the night was very still. Rosie had been asleep for 2 hours. Cole, who she suspected stayed awake longer than anyone knew, had not come downstairs. Margaret used to say the same thing, Ethan said quietly, that the house and the land were the same thing and you couldn't understand one without knowing the other. Clara did not respond immediately. She had learned the value of not rushing into the spaces his words created. She sounds like she was someone who understood how things worked, she said finally. She understood most things, he said. Not always the way other people understood them, but her own went, which was usually better. He looked at the table. I blamed myself for a long time, for not being here when the fever came. I was on a supply run to Laramie, 3 days away. By the time I got back, she had been sick for 2 days and had 2 more to live. He did not say this with particular emotion in the way of a man who has said it to himself so many times that the emotional content has been worn smooth by repetition, leaving only the shape of it. I have thought many times since then that 3 days were too high a price for a supply run. Clara looked at him steadily. You couldn't have known, she said. No, he said, but knowing a thing is different from believing it. She had no answer for this that was not trivial, so she offered none. She simply remained where she was present, in the same space as the truth he had just named. After a moment, he straightened, closing the ledger, the gesture of a man returning to the manageable present from somewhere more difficult. It's late, he said. Yes, she said. He stood. She stood. For a moment, they were both standing in the kitchen at the end of a day, in the warm proximity of people who have spent hours doing something real together, and the air between them had a different quality than it had ever had before, not lighter and not heavier, but more present, as if something that had been indistinct was slowly acquiring definition. Good night, Miss Whitmore, he said. Good night, Mr. Hargrove, she said. He went down the hall. She banked the fire and went upstairs. And at the top of the stairs, in the dark, she stood for a moment with her hand on the wall, feeling the house breathing around her, the way a house does when it is full of sleeping people and the night is quiet outside. Then she went to her room and slept without difficulty, which was something she had not done consistently in a very long time. The morning of the 22nd day, Deputy Warren Coates rode into the yard while Ethan was at the barn. Clara saw him from the kitchen window. He was a man of middle age with a careful, assembled quality about him, the quality of someone who has thought about how he appears and made deliberate choices, a clean coat, a badge that caught the light, the posture of someone accustomed to being regarded as authority. He dismounted with ease and looked around the yard with a specific quality of attention that is not casual. He looked at the kitchen window. He saw her. She did not step back. Ethan came out of the barn and the two men exchanged words Clara could not hear. Coates handed Ethan a document, and Ethan looked at it, and from this distance, she could see the change in his posture, not dramatic but present, the adjustment of someone receiving information that requires processing. She kept her eyes on the scene. Coates was explaining something. His hands moved once, a gesture that was expansive and apparently casual, indicating something to the north. Ethan's face remained still in the way that was different from his ordinary stillness, the stillness of control rather than the stillness of ease. After perhaps 10 minutes, Coates got back on his horse, nodded in a manner that was performed rather than felt, and rode back down the road toward town. Ethan came inside. He set the document on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. There is apparently an outstanding land use fee from 3 years ago, he said. Coates says it's in the county register. I don't have any record of owing it. Clara came to the table and looked at the document. It was officially formatted with a county seal and a set of numbers that were arranged to look authoritative. She looked at the figure at the bottom of the page and then at the date range cited. 3 years ago, she said. That would have been the year Margaret died. Yes, he said. She looked at the document more carefully. The seal was correct. The formatting was correct, but the fee amount was referenced to a regulation she had never seen mentioned in any of the other documents in the household files she had been organizing, and the fee category was generic in a way that was unusual for official documentation. In her experience of paperwork, which was not inconsiderable, vagueness in official documents was rarely accidental. "May I look at your land documents?" she said. "The registration files." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I want to see if this matches anything in your records. If it does, it's a legitimate fee you missed. If it doesn't match anything, then the document may not be what it says it is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come with me," and led her to the office. The land documents were in a wooden box on the shelf behind the desk, organized in the approximate manner of someone who has put things in order under the pressure of immediate need rather than systematic thinking. Clara went through them carefully, reading each one and setting it in a sequence on the desk, building a chronological picture of the land's administrative history. Coates had not followed her into the office, which was fortunate because what she found there she would have preferred to examine without an audience. The fee cited in the document did not appear anywhere in Ethan's records. That on its own might have meant the records were incomplete. But the land registration map, which was hand-drawn and carefully detailed, showed the boundaries of the Hargrove property, and there was an annotation in the margin in different ink from the rest of the document that had been added after the original drawing. A small modification to the northern boundary line, subtle enough that you might miss it if you were not looking carefully, significant enough that it would, if accepted, exclude the section of land that contained the creek and the associated water rights. She looked at this annotation for a long time. The ink was different. The annotation had a slightly different character to the handwriting of the rest of the document, and it was undated, which no official modification should be. She did not say this immediately. She went back to the document Coates had delivered and read it again from the beginning, and this time she was looking for the signature at the bottom of the fee notice. W. Coates, Deputy, Sweetwater County. Coates had delivered a document. Coates had signed the document. Coates had on the same document he delivered pointed to the northern land as the subject of the fee. And someone she was now fairly certain had modified the land registration map to make that northern section appear to fall outside the fee arrangement rather than inside it, which would create grounds for a land dispute that could, with the right pressure and the right legal framing, result in Ethan losing the water rights to his own creek. She set the map down. She was not a lawyer, she could not be certain, but she was a woman who had spent years in environments where people with more power regularly found administrative means to take things from people with less, and she had learned to recognize the shape of those mechanisms even when the specific form was new. She went to the door of the office and called Pete. When Pete came in and saw what she had laid out on the desk, he looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Told you there was something about that north pasture." "How long has Coates been the deputy?" she asked. "6 years, Pete said. Came from somewhere east. Nobody knows exactly where." "And the annotation on this map, can you tell me when it would have been made?" Pete leaned over the map. He looked at the annotation and then at the main body of the document, and she watched him making the same comparison she had made, though arriving at it from a different direction, the direction of a man who had known this land for 20 years and had opinions about its documentation. "That mark," he said slowly, "was not there 3 years ago. I remember looking at this map with Ethan when we were planning the new fence line. That mark was not there." Clara looked at him. He looked at her. "Ethan needs to know this," she said. "Yes," Pete said, "but he needs to know it right. Not as a guess, as something we can stand behind." She nodded. "Tonight then, after supper when the children are settled." He nodded. He looked at the map again. "She's smart," Margaret used to say. "And what I mean by that is not the kind of smart that knows a lot of things, the kind of smart that sees what's actually in front of it." He looked at Clara. "Didn't think I'd see it again this fast." He picked up his hat and went back out to the barn. Clara stood in the office for a moment longer, looking at the documents arranged on the desk. Then she reorganized them carefully, returning each one to where it had been, except the land map, which she left open on top, with the annotation visible. She went back to the kitchen. She started the bread. She kept her hands busy and her mind working, which was the only way she knew to manage the specific combination of clarity and concern that currently occupied the space where her thoughts usually lived. At midday, two things happened. The first Rosie came in from outside where she had been sitting on the porch learning her letters from the primer Clara had found in the house and announced that there was a nice lady coming up the road with a pie. The second Cole standing at the window before anyone else said simply, "It's the woman from town, the fancy one." Clara did not need further description. She untied her apron, pinned her hair with two swift, efficient movements, and was at the kitchen table with the household ledger open in front of her when Vivian and Mrs. Doyle arrived at the door. Vivian was everything the situation had prepared Clara to expect. She was perhaps 23, carefully dressed in the manner of a young woman whose family has decided that her presentation is an investment with good features and the particular social ease of someone who has been trained in social ease rather than born to it. She was carrying a pie that smelled genuinely good, which Clara noted as information rather than threat. Mrs. Doyle was the real architect of the visit. Vivian was the instrument. They came in, were offered coffee, sat. Mrs. Doyle managed the conversation with the skill of someone conducting a piece of music, setting tempo, guiding the transitions, ensuring that each element entered at the right moment. She praised the house. She admired the children. She mentioned with warm concern that Vivian had always had such a natural way with children. Hadn't she and Rosie agreed that Vivian's hair was very pretty? And Cole said nothing and looked at Vivian with his father's gray eyes. Then Mrs. Doyle turned to Clara with a smile that had been prepared well in advance. "We so admire how you've taken to things here," she said. "It can't be easy coming from a city managing a working ranch household, particularly without formal training in domestic management." Clara looked at her. "I find that work is its own training," she said. "You learn what the situation requires." "Of course," the smile adjusted. "Though of course, some situations require more than learning as one goes. Children, for instance, benefit so much from consistency and stability." A pause that was not a pause. "It's so important that the arrangements here are properly settled, for the children's sake." But the room had a particular quality now. The quality of a thing that is happening on two levels simultaneously, the surface conversation and the real one moving underneath it. Rosie, who had been eating pie with the concentration of someone performing a serious task, looked up. "What do you mean settled?" she asked. "Rosie," Clara said. "No, I want to know what she means," Rosie said with the directness of a child who has heard something she recognizes as having more meaning than its surface and wants to excavate it. "We're settled. Miss Clara is here." Mrs. Doyle's smile did not waver. "Of course, dear. I simply meant that it's so important to be sure that all of the proper arrangements have been made so that everyone knows where they stand." "Everyone knows where they stand," Rosie said firmly. "Miss Clara stands in our kitchen, in our yard, and she fixed the stove, and she knows all our stories. That's where she stands." Cole looked at his sister. Something in his expression softened, very slightly in the way that his father's expression sometimes softened. The way of someone who is hearing something true, said by someone who doesn't yet know how true it is. Clara set down her coffee cup. She looked at Mrs. Doyle with a directness that she had been maintaining carefully below the level of open confrontation. "Mrs. Doyle," she said, "I appreciate your concern for the children. They are remarkable people who deserve stability, and I intend to provide it. Is there something specific you came to discuss with Mr. Hargrove?" A beat. Then, "I thought it would be nice for the children to see Vivian. She has known them since they were small." "Then I'll leave you to that," Clara said, standing. "I have fence work to assess this afternoon, if you'll excuse me." She went out the back door, through the kitchen garden, and stood in the cold air with her hands in her coat pockets and breathed. She was not frightened. She was not angry. She was thinking. She stayed outside long enough for the visit to conclude and for the sound of a wagon to diminish down the road. Then she went back in. Cole was standing at the kitchen window watching the road. He heard her come in and turned. "She didn't like the stove being fixed," he said. Clara looked at him. "What?" "The fancy lady." She kept looking at the kitchen like she was checking to see what was different. Cole looked back out the window. She kept looking at things that are different from before, like the stove being fixed made her unhappy. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the 6-year-old boy with his father's eyes and his dead mother's habit of sitting quiet and seeing what was actually in front of him. "Cole," she said carefully, "when you say different from before, Do you mean different from when the other housekeepers were here, or different from when your mother was here? He thought about this with the seriousness he brought to most things. Both, he said, but mostly the second one. He looked at her. The things that are different now are different in the same direction as when Ma was here. Like the kitchen smelling right again. Like the bread. He paused. He notices. He doesn't say it, but he notices. She looked at the boy for a long moment. Thank you for telling me that, she said. He nodded once and went to find his sister. That evening after supper and after the children were settled, Clara sat down with Ethan and Pete at the kitchen table and laid out what she had found in the documents. Ethan listened without interrupting. This was something she had come to understand was one of his genuine qualities. The ability to receive information completely before responding to it without the interruptions that signaled more interest in one's own reaction than in what was being said. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Pete added what he had observed about the annotation, the fact of its absence 3 years ago and its presence now. Ethan looked at the map. You're saying Coates changed the boundary notation, he said. I'm saying the notation is not in the same hand as the rest of the document, it's not dated, and Pete has direct knowledge that it was not there when you last reviewed this map together, Claire said carefully. I am not in a position to say with certainty what that means legally, but it is irregular. Ethan looked at the map, then he looked at Clara. How did you know to look at this? The fee document Coates brought had a vagueness to it, she said. In my experience, official documents that are constructed to obscure something tend to be vague in specific ways. They use categories that are broad enough to cover the thing they're claiming without being specific enough to be checked. She paused. I learned this at the mill. The company did similar things with wage records. He was quiet again. Then, Mrs. Doyle and Coates, he said. It was not a question. I don't know that they're working together directly, she said, but they appear to have compatible interests. Pete made a sound that was his version of confirming a long-held suspicion. Ethan put his hands flat on the table and looked at the map and the fee document. In the ledger, Clara had organized all the evidence of a household being run by someone who was paying attention. He looked at these things for a long time. Then he said, I need to talk to the county sheriff, not Coates, the sheriff himself in Laramie. Yes, Pete said. And I need to have this map reviewed by someone who can establish whether the annotation is a recent addition. Yes, Clara said. He nodded, stood, went to the window and looked out at the dark yard. Clara began to tidy the documents, preparing to return them to the box. She was almost done when Ethan spoke without turning from the window. You could have left this alone, and he said. It was in the files. You might not have found it. Even if you found it, you could have decided it was not your concern. She looked at his back. It is my concern, she said. I am here. This place is my concern. A moment of silence in which the fire settled in the stove and the wind outside found the gap in the north wall it always found, and the house made the small sounds of a structure that has been standing for enough years to have its own language. He turned from the window, and in the lamplight she could see something in his face that was not gratitude exactly, and not relief, but something that encompassed both of those things and went further. Something that looked like the particular expression of a man who has been doing something alone for a long time and has suddenly been given the experience unfamiliar enough to be almost disorienting of not being alone. Good night, Clara, he said. For the first time, just her name without the formality of Miss. She heard it. She held it where she would not show it. Good night, Ethan, she said. Pete looked at the table. He picked up his coffee cup and carried it to the basin without commentary. Clara gathered the last of the documents and placed them in the box and returned it to the shelf in the office. Outside, the night was clear. The stars were out in their full Wyoming abundance, more than any city sky had ever showed her, more than she had known existed before she came to this place. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment and looked at them. Then she went upstairs, past the closed doors of the children's rooms, past the sound of Rosie's breathing and the particular silence of Cole's room, that was different from an empty room carrying something in it, and went to her own room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. She thought about a document with an annotation that had not been there 3 years ago. She thought about a woman with a perfectly upright hat and a niece with a genuine pie. She thought about the water rights to a creek on land that Ethan Hargrove had worked for 15 years. She thought about a 6-year-old boy who kept things and noticed what direction the changes were going. She thought about her name said without formality. Then she stopped thinking about all of it because tomorrow would require her to be clear-headed and capable, and she had learned long ago that the best preparation for a hard day was a night's sleep rather than a night's worry. Worry changed nothing. Work changed things. She lay down, she slept. And in the kitchen below the stove she had repaired held its heat steadily through the night, the baffle newly packed and working as it should, warming the house from its center outward, the way a working thing does when it has been properly attended to and given the conditions it needs. The fever came on a Thursday. It came the way fevers do in children, without ceremony or warning, arriving between 1 hour and the next, as if it had been waiting for the right moment and had simply decided that this moment would do. Clara was in the kitchen finishing the bread for the following morning when she heard the sound from upstairs, not crying. Rosie rarely cried, but a particular quality of stillness that was worse than crying, the stillness of a child who does not feel well enough to make noise. She went upstairs immediately. Rosie was in her bed with her blanket pulled up to her chin, and her face carrying the dull inward expression of someone whose body has turned its attention to something internal and has no resources left for the external world. Clara put her hand on the girl's forehead and felt the heat before her palm was fully settled. High, not dangerously so yet, but moving in that direction. She went to Cole's room. He was already awake, sitting up in bed, watching the door as if he had known she was coming. His face in the lamplight had the same dull quality his sister's had, and when she touched his forehead, he closed his eyes. Both of them, at the same time. She went back downstairs with a deliberate efficiency that left no room for the cold thing moving at the edge of her thoughts, the thing that knew what fever meant in a household where fever had already taken someone. She put water on to heat. She gathered cloths. She found the medicine box which she had inventoried on her second day and knew contained willow bark and several other things that were useful. She was on her way back upstairs when Ethan appeared at the hallway door. He had heard something or sensed something, the particular sensitivity of a parent to disturbance in the sleeping sounds of a house. He was in his boots and shirt, not fully dressed, and he looked at her face and at the thing she was carrying, and she watched the color change in his. Both of them, she said before he could ask. Fever, not critical yet. Come with me. He came. In Rosie's room, she arranged the cloths in the water and began the steady, patient work of bringing a fever down by hand, the only reliable method available to them at this hour and this distance from town. She showed Ethan without making it instruction, simply by doing it in a way that made the process visible. How to fold the cloth, how much water, where to place it, how to watch for the signs of change. He learned immediately. He always learned by watching rather than being told. They worked in the 2 rooms for the first hour, moving between them, checking temperatures, replacing cloths, coaxing small amounts of water past reluctant lips. Rosie drifted in and out of wakefulness, reaching for Clara's hand each time she surfaced, gripping it with the unconscious strength of a feverish child, and then releasing it as she went under again. Cole lay very still with his eyes open, watching his father, not asking for anything, simply watching the way he did everything. Around midnight, Ethan spoke. They were both in Cole's room, Ethan on one side of the bed and Clara on the other, and he had been quiet for so long that when he spoke, the words fell into the room with unusual weight. This is how it started with Margaret, he said. Fever in the evening. By morning, it had moved into her chest. Clara looked at him across the bed. His face in the lamplight was the face of a man revisiting something he would have preferred never to revisit, but doing it anyway because the situation required it of him, because he was the kind of man who did not step away from required things regardless of what they cost. Cole is strong, she said. Rosie is strong. They have been strong since before I came here, and they are going to be strong through this. I know that, he said. Knowing it is not the same as feeling it. She had said something similar to him once before in another context. He had not forgotten it. She could see that he had not. I know, she said. They continued. By 2 in the morning, Rosie's fever had not risen further, which was the best news available. By 3, Cole had fallen into a more natural sleep, his breathing losing the shallow, careful quality of a sick child and becoming the deeper rhythm of genuine rest. Clara sat between the 2 rooms in the narrow corridor, her back against the wall, her eyes on the strip of light under each door. Ethan came out of Cole's room and saw her there. He sat down on the floor beside her, his back against the opposite wall, His legs stretched out before him, and they sat like that in the narrow corridor with the lamplight and the quiet of two children sleeping on the other side of thin wooden doors. She would have known what to do, he said, not as an accusation, not as comparison, as a statement of law simple and direct. She would have, Clara said, and she would have done exactly what we have been doing because there is not another thing to do. He was quiet for a moment. You're right, he said. I know you're right. The house breathed around them. Somewhere in the barn, a horse moved and was still. The wind that had been present for days had finally dropped, and the night outside was quieter than any night Clara could remember since her arrival. A deep wool blanket, quiet, that pressed down on everything. Tell me about Ohio, Ethan said suddenly. She looked at him. He was looking at the ceiling, his profile in the lamplight, carrying the particular quality of a man who is asking a question not because he needs information, but because he needs to be present with someone, and this is the way he knows how to do it. So she told him. Not the version she had given Mrs. Doyle, the factual inventory of her history, but the actual Ohio, the version that lived in her body rather than her records. The smell of the mill in summer, which was heat and oil, and the particular sharpness of raw cotton being processed. The boarding house on Broad Street, where the landlady kept a cat that sat in the front window and watched the street with an expression of permanent mild disapproval. The way the river looked in spring when it was still running high from snowmelt, and the light hit it sideways in the afternoon and made it look like something worth painting. She told him about her father, who had been a carpenter before the lung sickness, who had taught her to read not from books, but from newspapers that he brought home from the street corner every evening and read aloud to her while she ate. Who had said regularly, as if it were something that needed constant reinforcing, that a person who could not read was a person who had to trust what other people told them, and that trusting what other people told you was fine for horses but insufficient for human beings. She told him about her mother, who she barely remembered, who had died when Clara was 4, who existed in her memory primarily as a sensation of warmth and a particular light in a window in a room she could not fully reconstruct. Ethan listened to all of it without speaking, in the way she had come to recognize as his fullest form of attention, the attention that cost him something and that he gave rarely. When she finished, he was quiet for a long while. Then he said, "She would have liked you, Margaret. I've been thinking about this for several weeks, and I've been wrong to keep it to myself." He paused. She had a gift for knowing immediately which people were genuine and which were performance. She would have known within 20 minutes of meeting you that you were genuine, and she would have told me so, and she would have been right, and I would have pretended to be skeptical for longer than was warranted because that is what I do, and she would have found that predictable and somewhat irritating. Clara sat very still. "I have been skeptical for longer than was warranted," he said. "That is what I am telling you." She looked at the door of Rosie's room, then at the door of Cole's room, then at the man sitting on the floor across from her in the narrow corridor of a house that had been emptied by loss and was slowly, room by room and week by week and small repair by small repair, becoming something that functioned again. "You were not wrong to be careful," she said. "You had reason to be." "I had reason to be careful," he said. "I had less reason to be closed. There is a difference." In Rosie's room, a small voice said, "Miss Clara." Clara was on her feet before the echo of it had finished. She went in and knelt beside the bed and put her hand on Rosie's forehead. Still warm, but perceptibly less so. The girl's eyes were open and more present than they had been, the inward quality beginning to recede. "I'm here," Clara said. "I had a bad dream," Rosie said, "about the horses getting out." "The horses are in the barn," Clara said. "Everyone is where they should be." Rosie looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were still slightly fogged with fever but working toward clarity. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "Not, are you staying tonight? Not, are you staying until I'm better?" The absolute, unqualified version of the question, the one that children ask because they have not yet learned that it is socially inadvisable to ask the things you actually want to know. Clara looked at her. "Yes," she said, "I am going to stay." Rosie's hand found hers in the dark and held it, and Clara sat beside the bed and held it back and felt the fever continuing its slow retreat beneath her palm and thought about the word stay and the weight it had accumulated since she arrived in this place, how it had started as something practical and become something else entirely. something she did not yet have a word for but that she recognized by the particular quality of the feeling it produced, the feeling of a thing that fits. Ethan was standing in the doorway. She looked up and saw him there, one hand on the door frame, watching his daughter hold the hand of the woman who had arrived with a folded paper in a single valise and had proceeded without apparent strategy or announcement to fit herself into every gap the household had not known it had until she appeared. He looked at Clara. She looked at him. Rosie's breathing was evening out, moving towards sleep. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. The fevers broke by morning. Both of them within an hour of each other, the bodies of two small people, completing the work they had been doing all night and returning to their ordinary temperatures with the matter-of-fact efficiency of children who recover from things with a speed that makes adults feel they are watching a different species manage the same planet. By mid-morning, Rosie was asking for bread with butter and whether the cat from the McGinty farm had had her kittens yet. By noon, Cole had dressed himself and gone outside to look at the horses, and Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched him move through the yard with his hands in his pockets and his face tilted up toward the late autumn sky, and felt something in her chest that she had been carrying at a careful distance come closer. Ethan found her there. He came to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and looked out at his son in the yard. "Thank you," he said. "You were there too," she said. "Yes," he said, "but it was different having you there." He paused in the way of a man working through something in real time. "It has been different having you here. All of it, from the first morning." She looked out the window. "Clara," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the measuring look, and not the considering look, and not the quality of careful assessment that was his standard mode of engagement with the world. This was something that had moved past assessment entirely, something that had arrived at its conclusion and was now simply present, with that conclusion unguarded in a way that she understood cost him considerably. "I have not been able to find the right time to say this," he said. "I have been looking for a time when it would not be premature and when I would have the words in the right order and when I was certain enough not to make a mistake." A pause. "I have concluded that there is no such time and that waiting for it is a form of dishonesty I can no longer afford." She was very still. "I am not a man who says things easily," he said. "Margaret knew this and accounted for it. She said I expressed affection through work, through presence, through small, practical demonstrations, rather than through language." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that when I repaired the stove baffle, I was not only repairing the stove." Something moved in her chest, warm and sudden, that she had been keeping at a distance for several weeks, and that she found she no longer had the architecture to contain. "Ethan," she said, "I am falling in love with you," he said. "I recognize that this is not the conventional arrangement. I recognize that you came here under the specific set of circumstances, and that I have no right to assume anything about how you regard those circumstances or how you regard me." He held her gaze. "But I have been wrong before about the cost of honesty, and I find I am not willing to be wrong about it again in this direction." She looked at him for a long moment, at the weathered face and the careful hands, and the gray at his temples, and the quality in his eyes that was the same quality she had seen in Cole's eyes, keeping things, noticing the direction of change. She thought about Ohio and the mill and the folded paper on the train and the way the land had looked enormous and indifferent when she stepped off that train and into this territory. She thought about a stove baffle repaired in the evening and a ledger reorganized in a corridor at 3 in the morning with two sick children on the other side of thin wooden doors. She thought about the word stay. "I came here," she said, "because I had no other place to go. That is the truth, and I will not pretend otherwise." She held his gaze. "But I have stayed these past weeks because of this place. Because of this household. Because of two children who hide frogs in shoes and ask if you know how to do the voices." She paused. "And because of you. Because of the person you are, which I have had the advantage of observing at close range for long enough to know that it is consistent and genuine and more than I expected worth knowing." He was very still. "I do not know if what I feel is the same thing you feel," she said. "I have not had sufficient experience with the feeling to be certain of its category. But I know that when I think about leaving this place, something in me refuses the idea with a firmness that I have learned to trust." She looked at him. "That seems like relevant information." He reached out and put his hand over hers on the windowsill. His hand was rough and warm and rested there with the ease of something that has found where it belongs. "It is," he said, "extremely relevant." Outside, Cole had turned and was looking at the kitchen window. He looked at his father and Clara standing side by side at the glass at his father's hand over hers. His expression did not change in any dramatic way. He simply looked for a moment with those keeping eyes, and then he turned back to the horses. Rosie appeared at the kitchen doorway behind them, bread in one hand, looking at the same scene her brother was looking at from the yard. "Are you getting married?" she asked with the directness of a child who has decided that the question has been taking too long to surface on its own and requires assistance. They turned. "Rosie," Ethan said. "Because Cole and I decided," Rosie said. "We decided a while ago. We were just waiting for you to figure it out." From the yard, without turning from the horses, Cole said nothing, but his shoulders just perceptibly settled. The confrontation came 4 days later, on a morning so cold that the frost had formed on the inside of the kitchen windows overnight, and the water in the basin had a thin skim of ice that Clara broke with her knuckles before she washed her face. Ethan had gone to Laramie. He had gone 2 days earlier, taking the land map and the fee document and a letter from Pete, who had written in the slow, deliberate hand of someone for whom writing was a serious undertaking, a detailed account of when he had last seen the map, what it had shown at that time, and what he observed about the current annotation. He had gone to see the county sheriff, as he had said he would, and he had gone to see a land attorney whose name he had found through a contact in Laramie, and he had expected to be gone 2 days. He had been gone for 2 days. He had not returned yet. Clara was managing the ranch without him, which was a different thing from managing the household. The ranch hands were respectful, as they always were in Ethan's presence, and had increasingly been in his absence the deference of men who respected competence and who had been watching for 6 weeks as Clara demonstrated it in consistently different contexts. Pete was present and available and reliable in the way of something that has been a fixture for so long it has become structural. She was checking the water situation in the barn with Pete when she heard the wagon coming up the road from town. She came out of the barn and looked. Coates. And behind him, a second rider she did not recognize, a man in a better coat than Coates wore, carrying himself with the posture of someone who is used to the coat he is wearing and what it represents. And behind them a buggy, which was not a working vehicle, but a visiting one, and in the buggy, unmistakably, Mrs. Agnes Doyle, dressed for something important. Pete came out of the barn and stood beside her. "That's a lawyer," Pete said, looking at the man in the better coat, "or something wanting to look like one." Coates pulled up in the yard and looked down at Clara with the practiced authority of a man who has rehearsed this particular approach. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I need to speak with Mr. Hargrove." "Mr. Hargrove is away on business," she said. "When will he return?" "When his business is concluded." Coates exchanged a look with the man beside him. "We have a legal matter that requires his attention. It concerns the land registration situation I discussed with him recently." He paused with the precision of someone deploying a prepared statement. "Given that Mr. Hargrove is absent, and given that your own status in this household is not formally established, I'm afraid the situation is somewhat irregular." From the buggy, Mrs. Doyle descended with the assistance of no one, because she was a woman who had not required assistance with anything in 30 years. She came to stand at the edge of the yard with her hands folded and her hat very upright, and her expression containing everything she had wanted to say for 6 weeks in a form that was about to become audible. "Miss Whitmore," she said with the warmth of something that was not warm at all, "I think we all need to have an honest conversation about the situation here." From the house, the front door opened. Rosie came out onto the porch in her coat, because Clara had told her before going to the barn that if she went outside she needed her coat, and Rosie had actually put it on, which was notable. She stood on the porch and looked at the assembled visitors in the yard with the expression of a 6-year-old who has decided that something is happening that concerns her household and that she has not been consulted. Cole came out behind her. He did not have an expression. He just stood there. Clara looked at the children, then at Coates, then at Mrs. Doyle. Then she said to Pete very quietly, "Can you keep an eye on things here for a moment?" "Yes," Pete said. She walked across the yard to the buggy past Coates and the man who might be a lawyer and stopped in front of Mrs. Doyle. She was aware that the ranch hands were watching from the corral fence, that Pete was watching from the barn door, that Rosie and Cole were watching from the porch. She was aware that this was a moment that would be talked about in Cold Creek for some time regardless of how it concluded, and that she therefore had some control over what was said. "Mrs. Doyle," she said, "I think you have come here today because you believe that, with Ethan absent, this is a good time to establish that my position here is uncertain. I understand the reasoning. I want to tell you directly that I am aware of it." Mrs. Doyle's expression did not change. "I simply want to ensure that things are properly arranged for the sake of the children." "The children are well," Clara said. "They were ill 4 days ago, and they have recovered completely because I spent the night between their rooms keeping their fevers down. They are eating well, sleeping well, and learning to read better than they were 6 weeks ago. Their situation is not a concern that requires your intervention." "The legal matter," Coates began. "The legal matter," Clara said, turning to him with the calm of someone who has prepared for this, "involves a land registration document that has been modified after its original filing. I have looked at the document carefully, and so has Pete, who has been on this land for 20 years. The modification to the northern boundary annotation was not present 3 years ago, when Pete last reviewed the map with Mr. Hargrove." She paused. "Mr. Hargrove has taken the original documents to Laramie for review by the county sheriff and a land attorney. I expect that review is concluding approximately now." Coates's face did something small and significant, a tightening, a recalibration. "That is a serious accusation," he said. "I made no accusation," Clara said. "I described a document. The conclusions drawn from that description are not mine to make." The man in the better coat was looking at her with an expression that had shifted from prepared authority to something more genuinely attentive. From down the road came the sound of a horse moving at a trot, the particular rhythm of a horse that has been ridden purposefully and is approaching its destination. Everyone turned. Ethan came through the gate at a pace that told Clara before she saw his face that the trip to Laramie had produced something. He pulled up and looked at the assembled gathering in his yard with the expression of a man who had expected to need to manage a situation on his return and had found it already in progress. He looked at Clara. She gave him the smallest possible nod. The nod that meant I have said what needed to be said. He dismounted and handed the reins to a ranch hand, who materialized for the purpose and walked into the yard with the unhurried stride of someone who is on his own ground and knows it. "Coates," he said, the single word carrying more than the name. Coates straightened. "Hargrove, I've come regarding the land use fee." "I know why you've come," Ethan said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "The Sweetwater County Sheriff has reviewed the land registration documents, including the original filing and the current version, which contain a boundary annotation that was added after the original filing and is not dated, not countersigned, and not in the hand of the registrar who completed the original document." He held the folded paper with the ease of a man who has been holding papers at the end of long days for 15 years and knows the weight of them. "The sheriff has opened a formal inquiry into the registration records for the past 7 years. He asks that you make yourself available to his office in Laramie at your earliest opportunity." The yard was very quiet. Coates looked at the document in Ethan's hand. He looked at the man in the better coat. He looked at Mrs. Doyle, and something passed between them that was more informative than either of them intended, the look of two people who have been sharing an interest and are now calculating, independently, what the cost of that interest has become. Mrs. Doyle looked away first. "I'm sure there has been some administrative confusion," Coates said. His voice had the quality of something from which certainty has been removed. "I'm sure there has," Ethan said. "The sheriff will sort it out." Coates looked at Clara. She did not look away. He gathered himself with the careful movements of a man understanding that his position has changed, without wanting to demonstrate that he understands this. He nodded once in the direction of no one specifically and turned his horse and rode back down the road. The man in the better coat excused himself with a brevity that was itself informative and followed. Mrs. Doyle remained. She stood in the yard for a moment looking at Ethan, and then at Clara, and then at the two children on the porch. Rosie was watching her with the frank, unself-conscious attention of a child who has not yet learned that staring is impolite. Cole was watching with the particular quality of attention that cataloged and retained. When Mrs. Doyle spoke, her voice had changed, not softened exactly, but recalibrated the social instrument, adjusting its register, because the previous register was no longer appropriate. I acted from concern for the children, she said. I want that to be understood. I understand it, Ethan said. Concern for the children is something I share. It is why I have been careful about the choices I make that affect them. He paused. Vivian is a kind young woman who would make someone a good wife. She is not the right person for this household, and I believe you knew that before you brought her here. I think the concern for the children and the concern for Vivian's prospects became confused at some point, and I understand that confusion even if I cannot accommodate it. Mrs. Doyle looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara. You are direct, she said, not approvingly, not disapprovingly, as an observation. I find it more efficient, Clara said. A pause. Then with a formality that was also underneath it, the smallest acknowledgement of something genuine. The children look well. They are well, Clara said. They are extraordinary, actually. I expect you have known that for some time. Something moved in Mrs. Doyle's face. Small and quickly contained, but present. She got back into the buggy. She drove out of the yard with the same uprightness with which she had arrived, and the sound of the wheels diminished down the road. And then there was only the ordinary sound of the ranch, the horses, and the wind, and the chickens that had scattered earlier, and were now returning with the haphazard confidence of creatures whose threat assessment is limited. Ethan turned to Clara. You held the yard, he said. Pete helped, she said. Pete watched, Ethan said. You held the yard. From the porch, Rosie descended at speed and crossed the yard and wrapped both arms around Ethan's waist in the manner of a child who has been waiting for permission to do this and has decided that the permission is now implicit. He put his hand on the back of her head with the ease of long practice. Cole came down the porch steps more slowly and stopped beside Clara. He did not hug her. He stood close enough that his shoulder was almost touching her arm and looked out at the gate where the visitors had gone. They're not coming back, he said. It was not a question. Not like that, Clara said. He nodded. After a moment, he said, Good. That evening after supper, after the dishes and the children settled, and the fire banked, and the ranch quiet under a cold, clear sky crowded with stars, Clara put on her coat and went out to the porch. She had not planned it as anything other than needing air, the need that comes after a long day of contained alertness when you have been managing and thinking and responding, and you need a moment in which no management is required. She stood at the porch railing and looked out at the hills. Ethan came out behind her. He stood beside her, not touching, looking out at the same dark shapes against the darker sky demo. The stars were extraordinary tonight. The kind of stars that remind you that you are standing on something that is moving through something enormous, and that the concerns of any particular day, however pressing, are taking place at a particular scale that is not the only scale available. The garden, Ethan said. She looked at him. I would like it if you went into the garden, he said. I would like it if you considered it yours to do with as you see fit, whatever that means to you. She was quiet for a moment. Are you certain? Margaret built that garden because she believed things should be used, he said. She believed that leaving something untended was a form of waste she could not endorse. I think she would have found me leaving it to go to seed for 3 years both predictable and somewhat irritating. A pause. She would have told me to let someone tend it. She would have told me specifically to let you tend it. She would have been right. Clara looked out at the dark. She could not see the garden from this side of the house, but she knew where it was, had walked past the gate every day for 6 weeks, had looked at it and left it alone and waited without knowing exactly what she was waiting for. I'll start it in the spring, she said. There's too much to clear before then to plant properly, but I'll start clearing when the ground thaws. I'll help, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the hills with the same steadiness he brought to everything a man who said, I'll help, and meant it in the complete and physical and daily sense, not as a figure of speech, but as a fact about the future. She turned back to the hills. Their arms were almost touching on the railing. She said, yes. When we discussed formalizing the arrangement, she said, I would like to do that. I would like it done before Rosie asks me again whether we are getting married, because the next time she asks, I would prefer to have an answer that is not evasive. He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him, sudden and genuine and entirely unguarded, startling in the cold air. She has asked you already, he said. 3 times, Clara said. Once with Cole present, who said nothing but was clearly endorsing the question. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could feel the smile settling into his face, the kind of smile that has nowhere particular to be and no reason to be anywhere else. Then we should give them an answer, he said. We should, she agreed. He turned from the railing to face her. She turned to face him. In the lamplight coming through the kitchen window, she could see his face clearly, the weathered lines of it, the gray at his temples, the eyes that kept things and saw what was actually in front of them. He reached out and put his hand against her cheek, the same rough warmth she had come to associate with the particular quality of this man who worked until his hands showed it and who touched things with care. Clara Whitmore, he said with a directness that was the only register he had ever operated in, and that she had come to understand was not curtness, but its opposite, the absence of performance, the simple willingness to say the real thing. Yes, she said, not answering a question, answering something larger than a question, answering the whole of what he had become in 6 weeks of shared mornings and shared trouble and shared nights in corridors outside rooms where small people fought fevers and won. He kissed her there on the porch in the cold Wyoming night, with the stars visible from horizon to horizon, and the hills dark to the west, and the sound of the ranch quiet around them. And it was not the kiss of a story or the kiss of a resolution, but the kiss of two people who have arrived at something true and are acknowledging it in the only language adequate to the occasion. Inside, behind the kitchen window, a small face was visible for exactly the 3 seconds it took Rosie to observe that her assessment of the situation had been correct, and then it vanished. The sound of feet on stairs, enthusiastic and ascending, was briefly audible, then quiet. They stood on the porch for a while longer, not saying much because not much needed to be said. The land stretched out before them, enormous and demanding, and particular the kind of place that required everything you had and returned something different and larger than what you brought to it if you stayed long enough and paid attention and were willing to be changed by what you found. Clara looked at it and thought, this is mine now. Not in the legal sense, not yet, and not only the land, the household, the garden, the 2 children who asked whether she could do the voices and remembered everything and kept things in those gray and watchful eyes. The man beside her who said, I'll help, and meant the whole of it. She thought I came with a folded paper and a single valise. I did not expect to find anything except a roof and 3 meals a day. The fact of finding this instead was not luck and not an accident, but the outcome of 6 weeks of showing up day after day for the specific and imperfect and extraordinary reality of this family. That was the only alchemy she knew. You showed up, you paid attention, you did the work the situation required rather than the work you had expected or preferred. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, the situation revealed itself to be something you had not known you were looking for. The month of November passed, and with it came true winter settling over the Hargrove Ranch with the serious and uncompromising intention of a season that does not negotiate. The woodpile supplemented by 3 weeks of work that included Clara and Pete and 2 ranch hands, and on one memorable Saturday morning, Ethan and Cole splitting logs side by side for 4 hours was adequate. The stove held its heat. The pipes did not freeze. The county sheriff's inquiry into Sweetwater County land records took 3 weeks. At the end of it, Deputy Coates resigned his position and left Coal Creek for a destination that no one in town seemed certain of or particularly interested in establishing. 2 other irregularities in the registration records were found and corrected. The northern boundary of the Hargrove property, and with it the water rights to the creek, was confirmed as it had always been, and as Pete's memory of the original map had said it was. Mrs. Agnes Doyle attended the following Sunday service at the Coal Creek Church and sat in her usual pew and afterwards spoke to several of the usual people about the usual things. She did not mention the Hargrove household. She did not mention Clara. On her way out of the churchyard, she passed Rosie, who was standing on the path eating a biscuit with the unself-conscious pleasure of a child who has found a biscuit, and she paused and said, "You look well, Rosie." Rosie looked up. "Thank you," she said. "Miss Clara makes good biscuits. Did you know you can tell if a biscuit is good by whether it smells right before it comes out of the oven? Miss Clara taught me." Mrs. Doyle looked at the child for a moment. Then she said, "I did not know that." And she continued down the path. She did not return to the ranch. but the particular quality of her silence when the Hargrove family was discussed in her presence shifted from something that had edges to something that simply occupied its own space without commentary. In Cold Creek, this was understood as something approaching a concession. They were married on a Saturday in December in the same church by the same earnest minister who had preached on patience 6 weeks earlier and who performed the ceremony with the focused sincerity of a man who believed in what he was doing. Clara wore the blue dress she had arrived in, which she had altered at the collar and wrists with fabric from one of Ethan's shirts that had torn past the point of mending, making the alterations in the evenings by lamplight in the weeks before the ceremony. It was not a wedding dress. It was the best dress she had made better by her own hands, which was a more accurate summary of her history than any other garment could have been. Ethan wore his good coat, which was slightly better than his working coat and had clearly been pressed. Rosie stood next to Clara with her hair in two perfect braids because Clara had done them that morning, and Rosie had held very still for the entire operation, which was either a testament to the occasion's significance or to the fact that Clara had been telling her the story of the girl who climbed the glass mountain and had reached the most interesting part. Cole stood next to his father. He was wearing his good trousers, and his expression was the same as it always was, the expression of a boy who is keeping everything he observes in a place where it will be available to him later. But when the minister said the final words and Ethan turned to Clara, Cole looked at his father's face, and something in his own face arrived at a conclusion and settled there. Old Pete, standing at the back of the small gathering of ranch hands and neighbors who had come, folded his arms and looked at the front of the church with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something to resolve correctly and is observing that resolution with satisfaction, but without surprise. After the ceremony in the churchyard, Rosie took Clara's hand and Cole's hand and stood between them and said, "Now it's official," with the gravity of someone completing an administrative process that has been pending too long. Cole said it was already official. Rosie looked at him. "Not with a certificate. It was official before the certificate," Cole said. He looked at Clara. "When you fixed the stove." She looked down at this boy who kept things and saw what was actually present. "Is that right?" she said. "Yes," he said, "because after that, Pa started coming in for supper earlier." Ethan, standing behind them, looked at his son with an expression that was equal parts recognition and the particular expression of a parent confronted with evidence that their child has been paying closer attention than they realized. "Noted," Ethan said. They drove home in the late afternoon light, the wagon carrying all four of them through the cold air, with the particular quality of a vehicle containing people who are going somewhere they want to be. The hills to the west were lit from the side, going copper and amber in the lowering sun, and the road north was the same road it always was, rutted and familiar, and leading to the same gate, in the same yard, in the same barn, in the same wide porch where two children had stood 6 weeks earlier and asked a woman they had never met if she was going to cry. Clara looked at the hills and thought, "Have been in this territory for 6 weeks, and I know this road now, in my body, the way the wagon sits on this particular section where the ground is harder, the way the horses adjust their pace on the grade before the gate, the smell of the air at this hour coming from this direction." She thought, this is what belonging feels like. Not an event, but an accumulation. Not a single moment of arrival, but 1,000 small moments of recognizing that you have already arrived. Spring came to Sweetwater County with the particular urgency of a season that has been held back too long. The creek ran high. The grass came up fast in the northern pasture, which Ethan had rested through the winter, as Clara's reading of the ledger had suggested. The horses grew restless. The chickens became ambitious. On the first morning warm enough to work outside without losing feeling in her hands, Clara went to the garden. She went in through the gate she had stood at for weeks without opening, and stood in the space that Margaret Hargrove had built and tended and loved, and that had been closed for 3 years and was now, in the particular way that things are offered between the living and the dead, given forward. She looked at the raised beds, the wooden borders intact, the soil underneath the dead growth still present, still viable. She looked at the path, the flagstones heaved by frost, but all of them still there waiting to be reset. She looked at the bench at the far end, one board cracked, but the structure sound. She had brought a spade and a pair of gloves in the first hour's ambition. She started with the path. Ethan came out after breakfast carrying 2 cups of coffee and stood at the gate for a moment looking at her. Working between the beds, the dead growth already cleared from the first section of path, the flagstones being reset by hand. He came in through this gate, which he had not done in 3 years, and gave her a cup of coffee, and stood beside her and looked at the work she had done and the work remaining. "The bench needs that board replaced," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll need your help with that. I don't have the tools for it." "I'll get them this afternoon," he said. They stood together in the garden that had been closed and was now open in the morning light of the first warm day of a new spring, drinking coffee and looking at the work that needed doing. Rosie appeared at the gate with her coat on. Wrong, the buttons mismatched her hair, beginning its morning escape from its arrangement. She looked at the two of them standing in the garden. "Can I help?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said. "There is a great deal of pulling to do, and you have very strong hands." Rosie came in and began pulling dead growth from the nearest bed with the enthusiastic thoroughness of a child given a legitimate outlet for energy. Cole appeared at the gate a moment later. He looked at the garden. He looked at his father and Clara. He looked at his sister already at work. He came in through the gate and picked up the spade that Clara had set aside and went to the far end of the path where the flagstones were most displaced and began with no instruction and no preamble to lever the first stone up so that it could be properly reset. Old Pete appeared at the gate because Old Pete always appeared when something was happening that was worth appearing for, and looked at the four of them in the garden, and then at the garden itself, and then out at the hills. He nodded once to no one in particular and went back to the barn. The work continued. The garden that had been closed for 3 years was opening stone by stone and root by root in the hands of people who had no memory of planting it, but who understood, in the way that such things are understood when they are genuine, that tending a thing someone else began is not a lesser form of care, but simply a different chapter of the same ongoing story. Clara worked beside her husband and her children in the morning light of the first day of spring, in a place that had been given to her by the woman who had built it and by the man who had chosen to let it live again. And she thought of Ohio, which had been everything she knew, and of this territory, which had become everything she had not known she was looking for, and she felt the particular quality of a life that has arrived at itself. Not by luck, not by accident, but by the daily patient, ordinary work of showing up and paying attention and refusing, even in the hardest hours, to put down the thing you are carrying before you have found where it belongs. The sun came over the eastern hills and fell into the garden, and the soil was dark and ready, and the season was beginning, and there was work to do.